And thank you very much, everyone here, for joining us today. So this story is going to be a little bit more of a personal story about the journey that Dawn and I have been able to go on over the past few years. And I think this is really important because while we often talk about how technology changes organizations, and that's true, it also changes people. So Dawn and I have been on a fantastic journey together over the last few years, and we wanted to share that. So before we get started, this is going to be a lot about exploratory testing and lean testing. Put your hands up if you're doing exploratory testing internally at the moment.
Cool.
Okay, great. So hopefully for those of you who've started this kind of journey, it wasn't too painful. And for the others who haven't started it yet, hopefully you learned something. So we're going to start off by talking about this personal journey that we've been on together. Then we're going to talk about the lean testing transformation that Dawn led at Toyota and now is leading at IATA. And it's really Dawn's story, right? And finally, we're going to talk about where to next. So our personal journey through testing in Tosca.
So our journey started in a small little country in the bottom of the world, and a small market that's doing really big things. So I joined Toyota New Zealand in July of 2011. They're based in a small town in the center of the North Island of New Zealand. It's not really the usual place that you think of when you consider IT innovation. And it's hardly Silicon Valley, right? But I guess for me, it was just a case of right place, right time. TNZ is a wholly owned subsidiary of Toyota.com. It's not shackled by the constraints of other big corporates, so we were able to be nimble and quick when we needed to make some change.
And when I first met Dawn, I was back in New Zealand as well, and I was running our test engineering team. And before I move on to the next slide, you might find it a little bit strange. So some context is that Chris is also the name of Dawn's husband. So I'd met Dawn just 2 days ago, and I got this text message. Hey, Chris, can you pick up something for dinner, XXX? And particularly at that time, I was not really accustomed to getting kissy messages from clients. So I texted her back, sorry, Dawn, I think you might have the wrong Chris.
I was pretty mortified. Never sent kisses to a supplier before. But I thought, hey, what the hell? He can still come for dinner, right?
And
I mean, we think of IT as being computer science, but it's not, is it? It's about relationships. We have relationships with our suppliers, we have relationships, and particularly as testers, relationships with developers, business analysts, the project team, and the product.
And I think for me, when you go on these journeys with customers and you develop this personal friendship, this relationship, that's really the key to the success. And so when I got this text message from Dawn and there was a bit of back and forth, that's when I knew we'd have a great time together. Now, for those of you who know a little bit about New Zealand, you probably know two things. There's lots of sheep, and The Lord of the Rings was filmed there. So this is my obligatory Lord of the Rings reference. And what it says, it's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to.
And boy, were we swept off, eh? The change that we've undergone over the last year is incredible. Over the last 5 years. We've all been there, right? The documentation is lacking or it's poor, timelines are tight, management needs results. Traditional testing at Toyota New Zealand wasn't working, so we knew we needed to change something. So we did. We changed a process, we changed a product, and we changed our lives. Tosca, TTC, testing is taking us around the world. It's taken me from Palmerston North to Switzerland.
And it's taken me from Auckland, New Zealand, all over the place in the US, and my team will know that I travel a lot. And now I'm based in Houston, Texas, which is a great city. It's not all cowboys with guns, just in case you don't know.
One day it's going to take us home again. But for right now, we're conquering the world, one test process at a time.
So let's move on to the lean testing transformation that Dawn led at Toyota and is leading now at IATA. When we talk about lean testing versus a traditional approach, Dawn, what do you mean?
So traditional approach for me is generally a prescriptive test. It's got step-by-step instructions. Testers follow those to the nth degree. They don't generally color outside the lines, and there's not much scope to get to know the product. You run the test case, it either passes or it fails, and then you report on the findings. Exploratory testing, lean approach, is a lot different to that. The tester gets to be hands-on. They don't have a prescriptive step-by-step instruction that they need to follow. It's not a free-for-all. There's some structure in it, right? But it allows the tester to go to the path that they need to go to get the outcome that they are expecting. And they might go to the place where the end user would go rather than where the script tells them to go. And we all know users don't do things that you expect. This is one of my favorite slides. It's a good comparison between the scripting process versus the exploratory process. So, like we said earlier, IT is about relationships, not just computer science. In the scripted methodology, the tester doesn't always get to know enough about the product that's under test. They can sometimes be divorced from the test designer, so they might not be the same person. So the test designer will have the upfront IP, then there's a bit of a gap. For the tester, they can't get to know the product as a whole. So they might only be able to test half the product. So much time is spent in preparation. You haven't got the time to spend making that relationship with the product. With the exploratory module, the tester's much closer to the product, so they've got time to build that relationship, get to know the product. We all know you're never going to test 100% of a product, right? But with exploratory testing, you've got a better chance of getting closer.
And for me, what I really like about exploratory testing is that when you're doing scripted testing, it's a linear process. It takes a lot of time from when you design your tests to script them, to execute them, to analyze the results. When you're doing exploratory testing, that is happening concurrently. You're generating test ideas, you're interacting with the application, you're analyzing how it's responding, you're gathering information to share with others, and that's all happening in real time. And if I'm asked, what is the one thing we can do to improve our testing somewhere? Exploratory testing is usually the quickest way to catch more defects.
Absolutely, because you're in execution, quicker, faster. So with the scripting model, you might spend 80% of your time in preparation, 20% of the time in execution. Exploratory testing flips that on its head, and you're learning all the way through. So even though you're only doing 20% of actual preparation, you've got 80% of the time in execution. So just because it's lean doesn't mean it's not disciplined. It's got a structure, and it's auditable. There's a defined process that can be followed. Structured exploratory testing, it might sound like a contradiction in terms, but it means we've got a set of expectations for the kind of work that will be done, for the outcomes that we expect, and we can measure.
So Dawn, this gives a little bit of a summary about lean testing. Why don't you explain what it means?
It's quite a basic approach, actually, and it's flexible. It can be used on all types of projects, so waterfall, agile, and it can be used for all types of testing. You can use it for system testing, integration testing, user acceptance testing. One of the things that I love about it is that it keeps the business at the center of the testing because it's involved all the way through. During the learning phase, the business is involved in the planning. During the modeling phase, they're involved in the test case design. During the performance phase, they're reviewing the results of the test execution. And during the feedback phase, the tester and the SME are talking through the outcomes. And from there, they can make any changes that they need for the next time that they need to do the exploratory testing.
And so now we're moving on to kind of the project timeline of what we're able to deliver together. And this first project here was actually before I'd ever met Dawn. So Dawn, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the challenges on this project?
Sure. So Project A was the first project that I worked on after I joined Toyota New Zealand. I was the sole professional tester on this project, and the rest of the team were from the business. The application was a bespoke application that was completely new to Toyota, and we had the business write in test cases based on their requirements. They were also involved in the execution, and if I'm honest, they hated it, absolutely hated it. The project itself was deemed to be a failure. Even though the individual steps of the project succeeded, the outcome failed. Now, we did everything that we were supposed to do, but it still failed. Not only was the project delayed, it also spent almost a year in hypercare. And after Project A, we knew that something drastic needed to change at Toyota. So in between Project A and Project B, I did quite a lot of research on the different methodologies out there, something different to the traditional way of testing. The business were complaining the loudest about writing the test cases. They didn't actually mind the execution, it was the writing of the test cases. So that's where I focused my attention. And during my research, I discovered exploratory testing. I also discovered TTC, and I discovered Tricentis. The main thing I discovered was that it didn't have to be this way. So Project B, this is where we started to involve professional testers. We also switched from HPALM to Tosca. It was in the days before the exploratory testing module was part of Tosca. So we still had to write manual test cases, but we did a lot of ad hoc exploratory testing. We started automating the functions that were regularly part of the regression. And in Project B, instead of 12 months in hypercare, we only spent 3 months. The project was actually still considered a failure, but testing was being seen less as the bottleneck. And the downside of the ad hoc exploratory was that we had very little reusable test assets. We had some manual regression tests and some automated regression tests. So in between Project B and Project C, Tricentis released the exploratory testing module of Tosca. Now, this is what I'd been waiting for. This was a watershed moment for me, and it changed my life. It changed my testing life. Actually, it changed my whole life. I finally had a tool that could meet my vision and help me work with structured exploratory testing. It was the tool that would support the test process that I'd been dreaming of. Like many test managers, I was pretty frustrated by the limitations of traditional testing, and I had a vision of how testing could be, but I didn't have the tools or the how. So TTC gave me help with the how, and Tosca gave me the tools to be able to do what we needed to do. So Project C saw us increase automation, increase the professional tester involvement, and decrease the overhead of the test scripting process by generating the automated test cases and the exploratory testing. The project was considered a success. Testing was not a bottleneck, and we had lots of reusable test assets. We had a lot of exploratory tests, some manual test cases, and much more automation than we'd had in the previous 2 projects. But the beauty of the whole thing was keeping the business at the center of testing, without the high overhead of the testing effort. So we had professional testers doing the testing, but the business involved every step of the way. Instead of the business being involved full-time on a project, 40 hours a week, they were now involved just 5 to 10 hours a week. And they were much more engaged and much keener to help out because they were able to still do their day jobs, but still be a central part of the project.
I think what's really important about this slide is that it shows that change doesn't happen overnight. You know, we went through a really tough project together still before we got to an amazing outcome. And sometimes when people start on a journey, they expect it to happen like that, but it does take time. You do have to go through some of the learnings yourself and gain that experience to be successful. So it was a really fun road to be on, even though all projects have challenges at times. Now, this slide, I think Dawn could probably write a book on this slide, and she could stand up here talking for an hour if she wanted to. But really, what we wanted to talk about is how test automation fits into testing. As you know, the Tricentis team would say, test automation in itself isn't sufficient. You need that exploratory testing. Manual testing is never going to go away. And one of the things that we talked about was a distinction between checking and testing. So checking being the kinds of repeatable tests that you can script and you can give to a machine, and testing being a more holistic approach where you would use exploratory testing techniques, engage with the software, have sapient human beings thinking about what they're doing while they're executing it as you go. So I think that's a really important message, that test automation was a critical component of what we did, and it was, ended up being manual testing was 10% of the test effort, but so was this exploratory testing aspect, and you need to keep that in mind.
And I think something really important to note is that, in my personal view, in a traditional scripted testing methodology, that's checking, that's not testing. So how do we integrate the exploratory and the automation? Well, we get the business involved all the way around. They define their business processes, and then the tester creates the script using the Tosca exploratory module. These can be converted into reusable manual scripts, and if they're executed as regression tests a lot, or we have plenty of other weightings that we assign, the risk matrix, etc., they can be converted to the automation scripts. And the power that Tosca brings with this is that it's all in one place. So we don't need the business to do their role multiple times and define their business process multiple times. They just do it once in exploratory testing, and we take that all the way through the life cycle.
And I think one of the key changes in the Tosca product was when they introduced exploratory testing. Before, whenever we would do exploratory testing, we would have that sitting over here, and we would have our test automation over here, and we couldn't combine them. And actually, the exploratory testing we did was very hard to utilize again. So having the two in the same tool and being able to build your test automation off your exploratory tests, that was a key change in the product which allowed this to happen. So Dawn said this was one of her favorite slides. This is one of my favorite slides. When we go to a DevOps approach, or when we go to lean or agile, a lot of it is about looking at software development as a process that we can optimize. So this here says every process has a single constraint, and that total process throughput can only be improved when that constraint is improved or removed. Now, what does that mean? If we've got a production line and it produces 100 units here, 80 units here, and 120 units here, there's no point in trying to make this produce more units, right? That's not effective optimization. What we instead have to do is improve the thing which is the bottleneck. And my experience is that so often testing is the bottleneck in the software delivery pipeline. So that's why we need to focus on improving that. And that's what we're able to do here. At the beginning of the journey, testing was considered a bottleneck, causing project failures. By the end of it, successful project delivery, and testing was no longer considered a bottleneck. And
we mustn't forget that testing itself comes with its own constraints, right? So what if your documentation is lacking or it's really poor? Well, in the lean testing model, it's easy. You just use a different oracle. So in September this year, I joined IATA, and they're in a similar situation to Toyota New Zealand, but they've already had Tosca for a year. The main difference is that currently they only use it for automation. So my role at IATA is to transform the test approach from the traditional test approach to a lean approach. It took 3 years for Toyota to fully embrace the lean approach and to realize the benefits. And the challenge for me now is to keep up with the level of change that the IT world is undergoing. Businesses now need to deploy quality software quicker than any time in history. In an on-demand world where instant gratification is expected and demanded, lean testing is helping to ensure that testing is an enabler and not a roadblock.
Thank you very much for being here. A big round of applause for Dawn.
And Chris.
Does anyone have any questions?
Could you put your hand up again so you can make sure he sees you?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Mohammed Al-Ibrahim, and thank you for a great presentation, actually. And my interest in this question is, how were you able to get the business, or the business department, or the project owner to be more involved in writing the test script without the exploratory testing? Because exploratory testing, you would need the actual application to be available before you can actually start writing the test cases or giving them the link for exploratory testing. But if you were able to move the business to actually doing things before having the application, what were the processes that you were actually trying to reach with the business to get them that involved in your projects?
So initially, when we did it, it was an existing application. So we started the business off with the exploratory testing on existing functions and existing business processes to generate their regression packs. And a bit later on, it became the new functionality. So as functionality was delivered, that's when we started writing it. But a lot of it in the beginning was about the regression pack rather than functional testing.
And I think both of these B&C were both COT software, right? So they had some functionality out of the box, and then it was configuration, customization, and integration.
Yeah, so one was a JDE application, and the other one was Salesforce.
Thanks so much.
Hi, thanks both for that really great presentation. What I find is difficult is getting the project managers to transform their way of working, because I see a lot of resistance, first of all, for the people for giving up their scripts, because they're like, how will people be able to prove what I've done? But also giving up money for automation. How did you manage to transform the project managers? Were you integrated into the projects? Did you deliver as a service? I'm kind of interested in the governance and how you were able to persuade them. So the first time that we did it, we did a small project as a proof of concept. And we demonstrated lean testing in a small, discrete project and how it was quicker and faster and the benefits that they would realize after that. After doing the proof of concept, it was easier to shift them into a bigger project.
I'd also add to that, when you have a really terrible project, that's often when you can get some impetus for change. And so I think, that was part of the benefit there. I mean,
the change was driven from the general manager level down, so I think it might have been slightly easier for me because they had the project was driven by the general management. So the fact that it didn't go well reflected badly on them. So for the next project, it was very clear that it had to be better.
And, we talk a bit about relationships at the beginning, and the relationship, a lot of people ask me the same question, right? How do you get something to be successful when you're doing this kind of project? There's no real easy answer. It's about building credibility, building trust over time, all these little things which I know everyone works really hard to do. But I do say there's no silver bullet to it.
The proof of concept did help, though, because it was solid evidence that this approach does actually work. There was a question on the side.
Excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What I find most challenging is the human aspect of getting people to change their behavior. So I like to say, yes, we can change, but we're way more wired as human beings for consistency. And Darwin was right, but only when death is the alternative. So that was a long preamble to say, what was the best way that you found to help your teams transition from what they were doing before, which they were hardwired to do after a certain point, to engaging in agile behaviors? Was the combination of successes that you then marketed internally? Someone from Duke today talked about having a monthly coffee house kind of thing where people would talk about their successes. And fear of failure is another barrier to change because people don't want to fail, and then they avoid change that might make them fail.
Nobody wanted to be on Project B. Absolutely nobody in the company wanted to be on Project B because the Project A was such a disaster that people were scared of being branded as being, oh gosh, I was part of that project and that also was a failure. So yes, absolutely. Again, the proof of concept really helped, but we we sold it to the business with, you don't have to do as much work. You won't have to do all the testing because we'll get professional testers in to do that, and you can help them. So we made it central, the business at the center, but they had lots of support around the edges. And we did have meetings and sessions. We had a big kickoff meeting. What is lean testing? What will it mean for me? What will it mean in my role? What do I now have to do? How will it affect me going forward? Well, and the big thing that we told them was, you'll get to do your job more. You'll still get to be on the project, but you get to do your job more.
I also, oh, sorry, did you want to say more?
I was just going to say, when you're working in agile mode, the demos at the end of every sprint can be a great marketing opportunity. So, you share what you've done, you can do it, test automation, exploratory testing, you share that stuff regularly, and that's, to me, one of the best ways to market internally your successes.
That makes good sense.
Because the business are there to do their jobs, right? They're not there to be testers. And that's what we sold them.
And then one other quick follow-on question. Are you guys looking at all at scaled agile framework? Because I see with SAFe 4.x, it's focusing more on systems engineering and IoT and automation in both automotive and other kinds of manufacturing environments. So I was curious if you're looking at scaled agile at all.
So there wasn't scaled agile in place at Toyota. It was more of a scrum of scrum situation. But I can say that scaled agile, SAFe, is probably the most common framework that I'm seeing in enterprise organizations at the moment. And I think we talked about this a little bit while we were preparing. You shouldn't just take something like SAFe and apply that 100% to your organization. Take it as a basis and, shift it around to fit your culture, your people, your skills.
So when I did my research in between Project A and Project B, I looked at so many methodologies. And Toyota was a really difficult one. When you first think of Toyota, you think of lean processes, and you think they're going to run like clockwork, and their factories do, but their IT was horrific. It was just such a shoddy place. They had very little processes, and they outsourced a lot. So there was a lot of disjointedness around the place. And I forgot where I was going with that now. Sorry, guys.
Thank you very much, Dawn. I think we're out of time. But thank you very much for sharing your personal story with us. And